Supreme Allied Commander pointed out that the interoperability of NATO's land forces are better now than they've ever been because of the last 10 years we've all been together in Afghanistan. My job is to make sure we retain that interoperability after the ISAF mission. So that means exercises, looking for opportunities to train together, contingency type operations. And the key to that interoperability is going to be meeting the same standard, all the different land forces meeting the same NATO standard, and having the ability to communicate together, both data, video, voice, modern communication systems, they all have to work together.
So just to be clear, you are overseeing the readiness of more than just U.S. troops taking part in NATO.
Sure, 28 nations in NATO, 27 of those nations have land forces. Each nation, of course, has the sovereign right to arm and equip itself as it sees fit, but our job is to help encourage them and ensure that they purchase equipment, have systems that are interoperable with other NATO nations. I go to national exercises. I was in Estonia and Lithuania last week. We'll be in Greece and Albania next week. We'll go to a British exercise later this month. Going to those exercises and looking for, are we meeting NATO standards? Do our command communications and information systems operate together? And also, the SACUR, Supreme Allied Commander, said he expects Land Command to be the first line of defense for jointness. So I look for, do we have special operations forces included in these exercises, cyber, air?
It sounds simple, but nothing's ever as simple as it sounds. So where's the struggle?
You're talking about 28 nations, things that are inherent to the nature of an alliance. The different nationalities, different systems, languages, those are some of the challenges to doing that. And also there is sometimes there's a gap between what the political leadership has said, has stated policy that comes out of NATO, but then when it's time to implement them, the nations also have to provide the resources. But that's the nature of an alliance. You know, it takes 28 nations to agree, which is hard. But once you do get 28 nations to agree, it's incredibly powerful.
In this job, how much do politics get in the way of getting the job done?
The nature of the alliance is you have 28 different nations. And so there will be things that, from a purely practical standpoint, in the round will seem obvious, or okay, we need to do this. But a nation may object for reasons that, from that national perspective, make great sense. So you figure out, okay, are there ways we can accomplish what's needed while still keeping the alliance strong? You want everybody to stay on the team. And that also happens, frankly, inside headquarters. In my headquarters, we have 23 different nations represented. It's not unusual that an issue will come up where an officer from one nation his nation has a completely different view than others will. You figure out how to keep the team together and solve those issues.
So the idea is to make all these armies combat ready, ready to fight. Whose standards do you use?
NATO standards. There is something called the Combat Readiness Evaluation, CREVAL. That is the standard by which all land forces are evaluated. So for example, the exercise we're attending right now here in Poland called Steadfast Jazz, the land component of the NATO response force, which is led by the French Rapid Reaction Corps, has to meet the combat readiness evaluation standards. So it's a NATO document, all the nations have agreed to it. So that's what we use to certify the land component of the NATO response force.
Exercises like Steadfast Jazz, are they truly important?
The Alliance decided back at the Lisbon Summit that it had to do some things to make sure it was relevant for life after ISAF. When the ISAF mission transitions to resolute support, the Alliance is going to transition from a deployed or campaign posture to a contingency posture. So you'll see more training exercises, multi-echelon, complex exercises, but focused on different contingencies. The second part of it, of course, is deterrence. To be able to demonstrate that the Alliance can still bring together multinational formations that can do high-end kinetic operations is an important part of deterrence. We are an alliance, and it helps reassure members of the alliance who look at the world through a historical context that might be different from other parts of the alliance.
What kind of threats do you train for?
At the one end, at the high end of the spectrum, would be a large-scale force-on-force. If some country or some group felt that it could make a territorial claim somewhere, then of course you have other contingencies, like when Turkey asked for Patriot air defense systems to protect it from Scuds coming out of Syria. Now, no Scud missile had landed in Turkey yet, but all 28 nations agreed that the threat was real, and so they agreed to send Patriot systems from the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands to southeastern Turkey. That was a contingency that you would have to practice. And of course, there's cyber, terrorism, anti-piracy, and so on. But the hardest one to do is the high-end, combined arms, joint, kinetic sort of operation. It's the most complicated. That's the one that we're practicing.
But this is Europe, sir. I've never really thought of Europe as being a dangerous place.
I think if you live in certain parts of Europe and you look back over the past 500 years, you know, you'll have a different view of that. I was with two officers the other day, young colonels, who remember being, as a lieutenant, involved in violent confrontations with departing occupation forces at the end of the Cold War. That's something that most Americans, I was not even aware of it, but this is real time for some of them. So there are different types of security threats, not what we remember from World War II or something like that, but all of them have real security issues.
Are you the first U.S. commander at Allied Land Command?
Allied Land Command is a new headquarters. At the Lisbon Summit, when the Alliance decided to, in order to remain relevant, they also had to be sustainable or affordable, which means we had to get smaller. So the result was one land command, as well as one air command and one maritime command. So this is a new headquarters, and so sure, I'm the first commander of Allied Land Command. There have been previous versions of regionally focused land commands, but in its present shape, we're new. We just achieved IOC, initial operational capability, last month. We are going to celebrate our first birthday here at the end of this month, and so yes, I am the first one.
Does it seem to make a difference having an American in charge, especially a combat-tested American?
Two things. One, it demonstrates that the United States still sees the importance of being involved in Europe, of providing leadership, that the alliance is important. I am convinced, and I think most professionals are convinced, that we, the United States, will never do anything by ourselves again. We don't have the capacity, number one. Number two, we've learned that other nations will have insights about trouble spots or potential areas, or will know things that Americans would never know. And so we've learned to incorporate that into what we're doing. I am sure we are always going to be part of a coalition, if not an alliance. The most reliable partners we have come from NATO, plus Australia. That's why it matters being involved in NATO, staying connected, maintaining these relationships, so that we all are on the same standard, our communication systems all work. So if we do have to build a coalition of the willing with just a few nations, the most likely members of that coalition will be people that we already know, we've already trained with. So having an American in Land Command helps the United States be involved in that process.
You seem to spend a lot of time trying to connect with the other soldiers of the other forces, and yet at the same time promoting the idea of Allied Land Command.
Secretary General Rasmussen has talked about the Connected Forces Initiative as a necessary part of NATO's future. There's a philosophical aspect to that, you know, strengthening the fabric of the alliance. So we spend a lot of time maintaining and strengthening relationships between Army leaders, between soldiers and the defense ministries, the training centers, and so on. And then there's a technical connectivity, literally trying to make sure that we can all operate on the same command net. The one that we would fight on, we want to live on it, and that expands the capacity of the alliance. And so I'm also trying to get non-NATO specific training centers, for example, like Grafenwehr or Wildflecken, or the Brits have a wonderful training center at Warminster. Get them literally connected so that then NATO units could train in all these different places in a distributed way, be connected into one exercise. So you're using NATO command systems, NATO standards, but you're able to do it from your own nation. And you can get a lot more people involved in it that way. And that will ultimately be a lot cheaper than having to bring everybody to Grafenwehr or everybody to Stavanger at the Joint Warfare Center. So that is a huge part of what we do is connect literally as well as philosophically the land forces and training capacity of the alliance.
With the budget cuts we're facing, will it be difficult to keep U.S. soldiers involved in NATO events?
I think there's two aspects to this. Certainly the Europeans are concerned that when they hear about budget cuts and they hear about rebalancing to the Pacific, things like that, and they see that the U.S. Army, for example, as well as the Air Force, have a much smaller footprint in Europe than we did 10 years ago, they do get concerned. But I get concerned also. I don't think we obviously do not need to have, nor could we afford to have, the same kind of footprint in Europe that we have had in the past. But if you believe, as I do, that we'll never do anything by ourselves, then we have got to maintain those partnerships, those relationships. General Campbell, the commander of U.S. Army Europe, has a wonderful phrase. He says, you cannot surge trust, you cannot surge relationships. Those take time to build and you have to maintain. So for example, the live fire that we just saw with soldiers from 8 different nations, including 2 companies of Americans, all under a Polish battalion commander, indirect fire, rockets, engineers with Mikliks, tank main guns, artillery, air defense live fire. The trust that comes from that is, it's significant, but you can't just conjure that up. You have to build that through these exercises. That's why these exercises are so important, and that's why the United States staying involved here is so important. You can't just declare, hey, we need you. From a strategic standpoint, even as the United States looks at ways to do things more efficiently, i.e. cost less, and you start thinking, well, maybe we could just do all this from back in the States, and we'll just count on being able to go through Italian airspace or use a Spanish port or use a German airfield whenever we need to. We've been partners and allies for over 60 years with these countries. It is still hard. You can't take for granted that sort of access.
If it's that hard to get in and out of Europe, as a taxpayer, why do we spend the money to do it?
Well, it's difficult to work with different agencies of the federal government also. Of course it's going to be difficult, but you're talking about international, moving military capability through other nations. You can only do that with any kind of assurance if you've got an alliance where you have relationships and trust, and where you have worked and trained together, you share information. These are all policy decisions. The military professionals are ready to do it, but national policies need to reflect that if the United States wants to retain that capability. The other thing I worry about, as we've gotten smaller, is that we will not have nearly as many officers and senior non-commissioned officers who speak NATO, who know British officers, German officers, Italian officers, Polish officers. I was a lieutenant here over 30 years ago, so I've grown up in it. But that was back when there were 250,000 soldiers in Germany also. It's completely different now. I think the United States can get a huge payoff. You as a taxpayer can see a huge payoff if we at least fill the 2,000 NATO positions that are in Europe for the United States. 800 of them are in the Army. The other 1,200 are spread across Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps. And they're at places like Mons, Brussels, Naples, Brunsum in the Netherlands, my headquarters in Izmir. We've got U.S. Army personnel in Lille, France, and the French Rapid Reaction Corps, for example, or the Multinational Corps Northeast in Szczecin, Poland, or the NATO Rapid Deployment Corps in Valencia, Spain, or the Alliance Rapid Reaction Corps, the ARC, in the UK. There are hundreds of positions like that when you, in the great scheme of things, that is such a small investment for the government and for the Army just to fill those positions, yet it guarantees an American participation and role in every aspect of NATO's command structure and force structure.
Sir, how do you envision the future of Allied Land Command?
When I see an American soldier, I see a NATO soldier. When I see a Polish soldier, I see a NATO soldier. When I see an Italian soldier, I see a NATO soldier. That's how I look at all the land forces of the alliance. And so my job is to make sure that they are effective and interoperable. That means having training exercises. That means connecting everybody's command posts, their training centers, the simulation centers, speaking at the defense universities, the staff colleges of all these countries, encouraging officers from the different nations to go to each other's. That's the kind of job that you never finish, that my successor and his successor will continue to look for ways to conduct complex multi-echelon training exercises within a joint environment. And so I think as our headquarters matures, we'll get better at that.